Welcome to A Dialogue. Being raised as a member of the urban and suburban poor, I had little access to the knowledge of our ancestors. Nature was simply foreign to me. As I've grown older, I've wearily accepted nature as a close friend, and in 2020, I settled down on a small Amish farmstead of 10 acres. When I wasn't busy installing electricity and water and plumbing, modern amenities to an otherwise structurally sound home, I was experimenting with all the things that I simply did not know. As a small holder of a mixed flock of sheep and goats on an even smaller plot of land, the most important and pressing need happens to be winter feed in the form of hay. You have a few options here, none of which are ideal. You could buy an expensive tractor and essentially turn your sheep herding into a hobby where you perennially lose money. You can purchase a secondhand tractor and turn your free time into learning how to be your own tractor mechanic and still lose money. You can do what I did and rely primarily on someone else, which means your small plot of land will be the least of their priorities, and therefore your hay will be cut late in the worst weather, before the worst weather, at the wrong time, or simply not at all. You could, of course, buy your own hay. In that case, it's hard to find a hay farmer that doesn't use excessive amounts of petroleum-based fertilizers. And again, you'd be cutting into your margins. You could, of course, take responsibility and produce it yourself, but this requires skill and hard work. This was when I was first introduced to Botan Anderson, who, using the ancient Scythe, produces hay the old way. I first bought a Scythe from Botan in 2021. My wife thought I was crazy, and as always, she was probably right. It takes skill and practice, which takes time, but there is something about being outside, listening to the blade of the Scythe swipe through the grass, the sound of birds as the sun rises, waking up with your blood pulsing through your veins. Jim Kovaleski, perhaps like Leibniz and Newton independently discovering calculus, happened to rediscover the Scythe around the same point in history as Botan. Instead of utilizing the mowed grass clippings to feed livestock, Jim has used it to feed vegetables. Much like Ruth Stout, this method eliminates most of the need for weeding, pesticides, and fertilizing. The solution to the problem of climate change resides in the ideas of these two men enacted on a world stage. Perennial grasses are much more climate friendly than annual plants that require bare soils or planetary exhaustive inputs. I'm inspired by the prospects of these methods just as I am with perennial grains like Kernza. As always, please enjoy a dialogue.
Young family, so I'm going to pass it on to him. I just wanted to make it affordable for him because real estate prices have gone crazy. So I was hoping to get some help with the crowdfunding. We've got some, might be a good down payment for a loan or whatever. But
yeah. So Botan, is it pretty cold up there?
Not anymore. It was Friday. It was 15 below, but
oh no,
today it's gonna be like 40.
Heck, the grass will be growing.
I know. It's this weird yo-yoing of the weather. We get nice snow, and I look forward to skiing, but then it's 15 below, and then it finally warms up, but then it warms way up. So it's supposed to get like to 50 tomorrow.
Wow.
And then the snow's ruined. Then I wait for some more snow.
Yeah, spring's on the way. What, a month away?
Oh, a couple more for us.
I know, but legally by the calendar.
Oh, yes.
Maple syrup will start running.
Yep. That's in about a month away.
Yeah, I'm hoping to get to Maine for that.
Yeah, you're in Florida right now?
Yeah, this is my peak of my season now. There's so much veggie in the garden. I'm working 60 hours a week.
Huh.
But anyway, where'd you come up with this whole windrow gardening? Was that before you had heard about me, or is it something based on what I was doing?
No, it was before I heard about you. I've been working on it a long time. Well, back in the 80s, I was inspired by the One Straw Revolution, Masanobu Fukuoka.
Yeah, quite a book.
Yeah, and I just knew that's what I wanted to do as soon as I read that book. But then, yeah, I was living in the city with a city lot, size yard, and I was doing what I could, and then I Ruth Stout gardening.
Yep.
So use straw for mulch, and Ruth Stout used hay. So I started just mulching with store-bought straw and mulch, straw and hay and compost I was making. And then my plan was to move to the country in the year 2000, and I bought 20 acres. And I wanted a way to cut my own hay so I could control the amount of weeds there were in it, and I wouldn't be dependent on machinery. And then one day I was watching Gardening Naturally with Elliot Coleman, and on his focus on tools, he presented the German scythe, he called it. And I go, that's it. I want to do that. So when I moved to the country, I started mowing my hayfield and then hauling the hay to the garden by the house. And then I was trying to have garden paths between the beds, but the ground was so rough it was too hard to mow with a push wheel mower. So I decided to spread the garden beds apart far enough for one scythe stroke, and then I just mow that grass with a scythe and use that right there for mulch. And I did that for a bunch of years. And then it occurred to me that why drag the hay out from the field to the garden? Why not leave it out in the field? And that's when I started windrow gardening. So then I mow and leave the windrow in place, and then I come back and make a double windrow, mowing into the existing windrow. And then I just keep that up through the season. And anyway, eventually I found out why that doesn't work, namely deer. The deer ate everything. So I was thinking, like, why can't I just leave it out in the field? But anyway, I ended up, that's another side story, but I ended up having to leave my farm, and I'm now at a land cooperative, a 500-acre land cooperative. And they were trying to start a market garden some years ago, but then they got too busy with their jobs. And they have this 1-acre deer fenced in garden, and I've been slowly taking it over the last few years. So I'm gonna have a whole acre to work with inside a deer fence, so I can keep experimenting with this windrow gardening technique. Yeah, and then
Cool.
I discovered you, and I was like, holy cow. You
So we
girls,
both arrived at the same solution in, different parts of the country, but the tool is what kind of makes it all possible. That
right?
whole windrow when you're mowing and you get all that grass all in one spot.
Yep.
It's just so miraculous. And luckily I don't have much deer problem up there. And I've only tried the true windrow, like mowing from both sides and creating a windrow doing potatoes. I've never tried anything else, but it worked great.
Yeah,
Jim,
that's
are
the
you
first
are you
crop I
from?
recommend.
Oh, sorry. I was going to ask Jim if he's familiar with Ruth Stout.
Oh yeah, the lasagna.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's what they called hers, lasagna gardening. I mean, and permaculture took a thing on that, and it's pretty much a
Well,
sheet mulch. So they go back and forth saying Ruth Start or sheet mulch, but it is, yeah, it's very similar stuff. It's a really powerful tool for gardening. That whole just piling organic matter.
the sheet mulching is more. The lasagna method is more in the like Gaia's garden. Ruth just used plain old hay. She's
That was
very
it. She
similar
didn't
to.
do anything else beside hay. I didn't read
I
her
think.
book. I just they motivate it.
Yeah, she would add anything that would rot, but she didn't go out of her way. Her main sheet mulching material was just.
The way I remember the book is that she had a 20-acre hayfield, which she had a neighbor bale for her, and in exchange for half the crop or 2/3 or something, the neighbor would take most of the hay, and she'd get a large stockpile of hay by her garden, and then she'd just be throwing flakes of hay on everything all the weeds that popped up, and then pulling aside the hay to plant seeds. And anyway, it's very intensive, just hay.
But But
Lasagna
it's
is usually layers of different types of organic materials.
Yeah, that's what I really have found so powerful. I did that once on a gravel parking lot, using three different materials with compost, seaweed, and a lot of hay from across the street. And I did like 3 layers of each.
Hmm.
And I did that like a Memorial Day. And by the second week of July, I was harvesting lettuce and radishes out of that on a gravel parking lot.
well, you're also doing that in your green or your hoop houses or caterpillar tunnels up in Maine right now too, right?
I am. That's how I'm starting beds with that caterpillar tunnel, but it's on fairly good soils too. I mean, there's already turf there, meadow grass, so that's a little better than a gravel parking lot. But and that's the thing, people are always worried the whole cardboard thing with the permaculture people. I mean, it's unnecessary if you can come up with enough organic matter to cover. I mean, I've smothered witchgrass, which I thought was impossible, but I've done it, and I've done a similar thing with torpedo grass here in Florida.
Botan has some interesting comments on. I don't know if is it broom grass that you're struggling with up there?
There's some, yeah, brome, but mostly quackgrass. Yeah, I'm thinking of writing a blog post called "Quackgrass Ruins Everything."
I wish I knew more, Latin names, but I think it's very similar. It might be the same thing, but regions call it differently. We called it quack when I was in Minnesota. Just big, long rhizomes that just run everywhere, right?
Yes. Yep.
And I've been able to, I actually inherited at that farm in Lamb Cove. I inherited an old chicken barn foundation that's all it was, right? And all I did is mowed it down and put 3 feet of hay on top of that, right? Fluffy, but 3 feet, and it was gone.
Huh.
Especially if you did it in the spring before it started really growing, because it didn't have any time to put anything back to the root. So I've beat quackgrass in Maine with volume, though. It's hard to plant into that.
Well, and that's an interesting thing about Ruth Stout's method is that people and maybe even Jim's method, because Jim and Botan, I mean, it's all a different variation of Ruth Stout's in some respects, but a lot of people start out and they have this massive amount of hay or grass or mulch, and they think that one application is going to do it, but you do have to have enough material for maybe a second application or a third application if you have something like quackgrass or a weed pressure.
And you need more every year on the same piece of land because the soil life eats more. You get more soil life that eats more grass that you got to put more on top. It disappears faster and faster. So that is the limiting factor on, keeping the fertility in the bed.
So Botan, have you cured the problem, or are you still, you think that the 1 acre deer fenced garden is overran?
Oh, with quackgrass. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. No, yeah. There's a 1/4 acre that is really thick with quackgrass and thistles, and that was area that the people that were gardening there were trying the Ruth Stout method with round bale hay, and the round bales had a lot of thistles in them,
Mm.
and the quackgrass just loved it. So that's where they're really thick. Usually the first year you can just keep piling on the mulch and plant within it and pluck any grass that comes up through it. But I found that, yeah, quackgrass, the rhizomes can stay around quite a long time and then keep coming up. Once the hay is more broken down, they'll come up. So I've actually started to, if quackgrass is a problem, I'll take the mulch off and I'll lightly broad fork the area, add a little compost if I can, and then I use a 3-tine cultivator to rake out all the quackgrass rhizomes, and then I'll put the mulch back, or fresh mulch if it's really infested with roots. I'll just let the stuff, the roots, dry into hay, and then hopefully kill the rhizomes and compost it or something. But yeah, if quackgrass becomes a problem, I found that I need to till a little bit and rake those out, rake the rhizomes out. Brome's not quite as bad, but it can be pretty rhizomy. It's a little easier to mulch out. I read on a more info part of a YouTube video that Ruth Stout really struggled with quackgrass, and she actually had to tear out her whole garden and put a wooden border wall around below the soil surface level, and then start all over again to get rid of her quackgrass.
I wonder if there's something to be said about Jim's method of using fresh grass instead of hay.
Well,
when I'm starting a new bed, I definitely, if I can get it green and even wet, because it gets that slime to it, that really is detrimental to any kind of growth that's, it's amazing how that can get kind of fermented almost. But still, the main thing is those rhizomes do stay around, but as long as there's no way they can get to sunlight, they're going to die. And, I've done it for years in different places, and it's always been able to work for me. And even what creeps in from the edge, I'm able to control without, any kind of tillage.
Well, hay has gaps that I don't have quackgrass around here. I'm not sure if it's the same thing, but I have Johnson grass, and I've noticed when I use the hay, I can see that the grass particles are going to reach towards the sun, and they can find their way in through cracks of the hay. Whereas if you're mulching with fresh grass, it gets that slimy, and it's got more weight to it. I feel like
definitely.
Yeah, the weight is key. Yeah, when the windrow gardening, I'm cutting fresh grass, and that's what ends up in the windrow all the time. And it's quite heavy. I classify mulches into two kinds. One I call smothering mulches, and the other one I call grow-through mulches. And hay put down rather thinly is a grow-through mulch. And I use that for like garden plots of grain. Put a thin layer of straw or hay mulch down and let the grains grow up through it.
Like Fukioka did.
Yeah. And for the windrow garden, I'm using, really concentrated smothering mulch. The full windrow of wet, so I mow in the morning when it's wet and fresh green grass. That ends up being quite heavy, and it does compost more than especially from the bottom up. It composts more than it dries out into hay, so it'll look like hay on the surface, but underneath it, it's all composting grass.
Yeah, my methods is almost always, I've changed it a little bit. It's mostly seedling planted, so you don't need, so you just part a hole. Even if the grasses are, the hay mulch is 6 inches deep, I can get to the soil and then just tuck the hay still around my seedlings. Whereas if you're doing direct sown, you have to have more soil exposed to be able to do that. You can make a big furrow in the hay, but that's where you'll have your weed pressure. So I've pretty much stayed mostly with seedlings.
Yeah, me too.
Well, Ruth did not. She was pulling the mulch to the side, exposing the soil and direct seeding. So that could also explain some of the weed pressure that she had.
Yeah, because as long as I can keep it covered, people just are amazed to come in the gardens, both places, and there's no weeds. Literally, there are no weeds. Unless for some reason I was, the second mulching, I didn't get it down early enough. So the first mulch that was, 6 inches deep in May is gone, in middle of July. And then you've got sunlight on soil and you get a little weed pressure. But that's why I don't worry about, weed seeds in hay. If they don't got, sunlight and open soil, you don't have a problem with it. Then, what I really started to think about was, I'm calling it grass-fed vegetables, but why won't the soil life eat the grains? Essentially, that's what weed seeds are. So, it could be grain-fed vegetables. It's a different take,
Well, that's another topic. That you both share is not necessarily the windrow gardening or the grass-fed vegetable method or Ruth Stout, but I also wanted to talk about the Scythe.
Yes.
Because an interesting thing for me was I I was looking for a method of making hay on a small scale, and I found Botan. And I happened to be on YouTube one day, and I saw Jim, and you were using a Scythe, and your methods of peening and honing were a little different, which was, as a beginner, it was a little confusing because you were the only two people that I could really look to give me advice, being isolated here in southern Indiana. But it was just interesting that you have two guys separated across the country that are utilizing a almost extinct American farming tool and having success with it.
Yeah, and there are many ways. I mean, when I first read Elliot Coleman's book, or I guess the second time through, and he was talking about the Scythe, all he uses is a file,
Yeah.
and he gets her done. So there are
Yeah.
many ways. I mean, the one thing I've seen a little in the Scythe community is there's this kind of elite kind of feeling that there's just way to do it and it's got to be perfect, and and that can really discourage. There are things that help a lot, but just get out and mow and you'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the older I get, the sharper I like my blades to be because it's a whole lot less work.
But we talked about it, and I'm doing the exact opposite of what you do, and I got a hell of a sharp blade.
Oh yeah.
Well, I'm leaving the burr,
Oh yeah, that's right.
and
Yeah,
I,
have you tried
it's
removing
just
it?
what's that?
Have you tried removing it or?
Oh, I always used to remove it, but then a couple times I'd forget, and it would be like, wow, that's awesome. And so over the years, I went from going with a really fine stone, especially after I'd peen, to a coarse stone, using it all day. I'll create the burr, mow for a while, and when it starts to curl, I'll knock it off and create another one. And I've been
Huh.
mowing like that for 3 years now. I mean, I use more steel for sure, but the cutting is so much easier.
So, to a listener that's not sure what your terminology is, what do you mean by the burr?
Well, so if you drag a stone or a file or anything across a piece of metal, it'll curl some of that metal back under the backside of the blade, right?
Yeah.
So it's really not a really perfect bevel. It's got a bevel with a bunch of hairy metal on it, like a serration, And I've just seen where that is so much. And if I can give that to somebody, suddenly they'll pick up my scythe and they'll go, "Whoa, what the heck?" Or I'll take their blade and do that, and they'll go, even if it's kind of dull, I'll be able to get that burr. So, I mean, I know this is all heresy to, most of the scythe community, but I mean, I'm, passing on what's been working for me for the last 3 years.
Well, the a scythe blade because it's like a half of a scissor. Like a one half of a scissor. There's nothing opposing it. So as you're drawing it through the grass and the grass stems slide along the edge engages much better if there is a little bit of tooth to the edge. And you get that tooth with a little bit coarser stones than you would use for like a kitchen knife, where you want a nice smooth edge. And as you're drawing the stone diagonally across the edge of the side blade, as you're trying to sharpen it, the grits scratch through the edge and leave it slightly jagged, and some of the metal can also hang on and then curl around to the other side. And that's what Jim's calling the burr. I don't think it's the burr that's helping the edge cut, it's the scratch pattern going through the edge.
That's
That's,
entirely possible. I'm just, theorizing that. I just know the
yeah.
results are that way. So it could be just that, scratch pattern that's given the bite, especially if you've got like, not wet grass. I mean, you really notice the difference when it's dry and you can pop into it and still get a bite into it good.
Yeah, bite's a good term. So it bites more with a little bit of a jaggedness to the edge. But the danger is creating a ragged edge. If you use too coarse a stone, it creates a ragged edge, which is very slow and doesn't cut as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my biggest learning curve was that initial, that peening is what you got to do, and to just over the peening the heck out of it, because you could see it starting to thin. And then, I'd end up with this really thin edge that was a little wavy, and then, I'd go into any brush and they would tear the hell out of it. And then I'd go back and repair it and try not to peen as much the next time, but I still like peening. And this way, I haven't, I'm still peening, probably every, I don't know, 3-4 hours of mowing, and I'm mowing a lot of grass in that 3 hours, so it's a lot
Right.
different than a novice. And I can go, especially after like an hour, I can walk into the woods and cut stuff, as big as my pinky and not have any tear.
Yeah, well, yeah, the scratch pattern that leaves the edge slightly jagged, this is like almost microscopic,
Right.
smallness. But yeah, it doesn't require as thin a bevel, and it'll still cut well. If you encounter bigger stemmed weeds, like we got this wild carrots here, Queen Anne's lace,
Sure.
amazingly tough.
No, I know. I mean,
I've
I'm
cracked.
talking about walking into, the woods edge, and I'm mowing, choke cherry and goldenrod and, big asters, and it just still walks through it. Where before I would have to, even I used to bring a different scythe when I'd go into that, just the one that had been peened differently.
Yeah,
But I have
Are
to
you,
say that roller guide is game changer for anybody that's peening. It just is such a good addition to a peening outfit. And
are
anybody that
you
doesn't know that, Botan developed this guide that helps you pivot the blade. Was that what you'd call it? So you can hold it without having to center it as hard?
right. It helps you keep the edge of the blade on the center of the anvil face.
Yeah.
Peeing with a narrow anvil is pretty easy, except that every time you hit the blade jumps around a little bit, and you got to put it back in the right position. And the roll guide just helps you keep it in position.
Yeah, it's game changer.
Yeah, I still
so
use it.
so so Jim, are you still, even with this different method, are you, when you say that you're able to take down pinky sized like choke cherry, are you still using the same amount of torque or physical input?
No, because so as soon as you've got something that's not a consistent pressure, so I love mowing like second cut, so you've mowed it once a field and it comes up, so everything is pretty much the same resistance as you're mowing. So once you start that blade through the grass, the momentum carries it and nothing really stops it. But anytime you've got levels and thicknesses of what you're going into, you're going to get up, kind of, so it's a
Yeah.
different motion for sure, but it still goes through it. And when you get really big stuff, you're actually just shooting for, sometimes you'll have a thumb size sapling, and if you can hit it at the back of the blade, and actually aim for that, you can still get that. Especially like popple. I love, you can cut big popple on a wood's edge and not even hurt the blade at all.
Well, another thing I wanted to talk about, and this is an interesting segue into it, is Jim, you had talked about, well, the first time I talked to you about how everyone wants to do the way that you do. Everyone wants to garden the way that you do, and they're really interested in a almost like a step by step guide, which they'll have success with that. But what's so interesting is maybe small scale agriculture is the last tier for doing things a different way and still getting success. And what I mean by that is we're so specialized in society that we almost actually creates this impression that there is only one way to do things right.
Yeah,
And
there
I don't
definitely is in there. It's crazy, but I mean, I'm doing a very similar thing with a total different resource here with the free yard waste compost I've got here. I'm just piling massive amounts of organic matter. My brother did a very similar thing when he saw what I was doing. He's been a traditional, landscape gardener over the years and, weeding a lot. And then he started using, because he had more leaves than anybody could imagine, because the city would give him all their leaves. So he started growing garlic using the same method, thick leaves, and man, he was busting on some of the best garlic I've ever seen. So you got to use your local resource instead of, if you're in, people use seaweed. I use seaweed quite a bit on the coast where we are. But if you're in the middle of Maine, why would you go all the way to the sea to get something that's so, dependent on, travel? Find something in your area, leaves, mulch, hay, all that stuff. Just find out what work or what can give you all that organic matter, and then use that and tweak it.
Well, yeah, and Botan, I know that I talked to Jim about this too, because from a scientific standpoint, I can't wrap my mind around you utilizing only grass, because I remember reading one of your blog posts where you talked about how you use fresh grass and leaves as a perfect compost combination in your garden because of the
Uh,
nitrogen to carbon.
yeah, that was when I was living at an old farmhouse with gigantic silver maples
Yeah.
all around the yard. So I just get a ton of leaves, and the soil was very sandy, and the grass was pretty sparse out where I was doing the windrow gardening. So I just utilized the leaves plus the sparser grass to create the windrows. And I put the leaf layer down first, and that seemed to make a really good during layer, and then the grass on top of that. And yeah, those have made really nice garden beds.
And that was fresh grass.
Yeah, I put the fresh mown grass on top of the leaves, and then keep on
I
mowing.
do believe the fresh isn't just the smothering effect when it's wet like that. I do believe, I still think in terms of a soil food web that's a micro herd of organisms, right? And, the difference between mulch hay and the hay I mow in June that's 9 inches long, the nutrition in that to whatever eats it's going to be a whole lot different. And I don't think people account for that. It's got a lot of dandelion in it, the spring tonic for people, and so all that stuff the soil life is eating, they're putting it in their bodies, they're pooping it out. So you're going to get a different result from the soil life eating that than the 3-year-old mulch hay coming out of a big old ground bale.
Yeah.
One thing I noticed when I used the leaves from the really shady yard was that I'd leave the leaves over winter on the ground, and then in the spring, the very first mowing, I'd mow and rake up all the leaves at the same time, and there'd be a lot of bark and woody sticks and things in it. And anyway, when I put that down as the first layer and then the grasses on top, I noticed a lot more fungal activity in that soil, in that compost. And in fact, I have some pictures of a potato bed where I had really mulched it thickly, and there was mushrooms growing all through that bedding. So anyway, the more tree matter you put into the layers of mulch, the more it tips the balance towards the fungi, the
Yeah, Will
mycorrhizae.
Bonso talks about that a lot. He thinks grass is not a good way to go. I argue with him a lot about that because he's all about woodland gardens, and that's where them trees got those big leaves that are these huge solar panels. But I
Right.
always tell him, you take those leaves off that tree, right, and that's done for the year. Whereas the grass, you mow it, it comes back up, another solar panel, do it again, another solar panel. So and that's where the soils were built so deep in the prairies compared to some of the woodland soils that are pretty thin. Most of the, carbon's in the wood of the trees.
Well, and Jim and maybe Botan, you can speak to this, but there's also the case where I believe you can make for certain species of vegetable, you can make the soil too rich.
Oh yeah, you should see what happens with the sweet potatoes when I put like triple the amount of black-eyed peas in before I left last year. You should have seen the leaf growth. I never seen it so thick, but I didn't get nothing for potatoes.
So how do you account for that if you're going to have a perennial garden bed?
Be on what your expectations are. My biggest thing for my summer garden here was to keep any weeds from jumping in from the outside. Because if you had an empty bed, even though you don't have any weeds because you mulch thickly, you know, everything jumps in from the outside. But if you've got shady cover, that can't happen. So my biggest thing was, any potatoes I got were gravy. It just prepared the soil for my winter crop, which is my, real money maker.
Are you utilizing cover crops at all up in Maine?
No, not at all.
So
So I believe what the Kaisers, they're out in the Singing Frogs Farm out in California, Sebastopol, right where Toby lived out there. But, they talk about every cover crop being an economic crop. So the sweet potato is a similar thing to that. But the idea that, arugula is a cover crop. So if I get 3 cuts off that and then cut it off at the ground, I've got this huge taproot down there that's feeding the next crop. And especially if I, cut it off at the ground and throw some broccoli in there that day, I've never interrupted a root association. And this is mostly just, parroting what they've talked about, but I believe that. So instead of wasting your land and the photosynthesis on something that just going to improve the land, why don't you have one that is an economic crop that you can sell that also improves the land? As long as you start looking for those crops, you'll find them and the niches. And it's, every, climate zone is going to be different and what's going to do good. And whatever your, substrate is, whether it's mulch or grass or leaves, you're going to find something that will just love that. That's my
in
opinion.
in Botan, you utilize cover crops pretty heavily, right?
Well, I have in our community garden here where you have to bring in the mulch. Sometimes like after potatoes are dug, I'll seed it with oats for a cover crop.
That's just because you want to mow them. I know it is.
Yeah, it's fun to mow. Well, the
Buckwheat,
winter,
right?
the winter kills it, so and then I
Okay.
just cover it with mulch for the next year and just garden through the mulch. I've been very interested in between my windrow beds, overseeding different types of cover crops, like organic farm conference. I found out that buckwheat's supposed to get rid of quackgrass. I've never found that to work, but I would seed buckwheat in between the windrows for more organic matter and bring up different nutrients from the subsoil to put onto the windrow beds. Yeah, buckwheat's really nice. I overseed a lot of alfalfa lately. In my One Size Revolution Facebook group posted a long time ago. He posted when I was first starting the windrow gardening. He said in Australia they do that with alfalfa in an alfalfa field. They will cut the alfalfa and pile up in mulch in these lines of mulch and plant them with intensive vegetables, and then they keep rotating the vegetable beds across the field over the successive years. But all the fertilizer and all the mulch is alfalfa.
Well,
Yeah, and Versa Land was another guy that came up with harvesting hay mulch from the field and planting in rows and using that mulch right there for tree crops, for fruit and nut crops. So they mow the hay and then with I'm not sure what you call the machine, hay tedder or whatever. It flips the hay over onto the windrow of trees. So those are all different mechanized tools, but it's the same idea as windrow gardening with the scythe.
Yeah, and I do
so
think we give a little too much, to the idea of chemistry in the soil. I mean, it's, everybody's saying, where'd you get your nitrogen? Where's your fungal coming from? All this stuff. But, we need to talk more and more about soil biology and how that all works. I mean, Michael Phillips, I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, so he really started tuning into using the scythe to knock back the understory, let's call it a meadow in his orchards, that if he cut it at the right time, the the root matter from what he cut starts to drop, like what happens when you prune anything. And if you do it at the right time, it's the same time as the fruit trees are putting out their feeder roots, the hair roots. And so if you pulsed it right, you'd be feeding right when the tree wants it. And who would have thought you could even figure anything like that out? But I mean, we just, we know so little. And then once we try to figure it or think we figured it out, then we have discovered it.
Yeah.
Well, we know so little that it just speaks to doing something, to
Right. And all
figuring
these,
it.
indigenous cultures used to grow a hell of a lot of food, and so did grandma, without all these courses and, soil tests and all that stuff. It is very simple. Organic agriculture is pretty simple.
But it takes experience. There's a lot of, especially with COVID. I don't keep up on the latest trends when it comes to homesteading, but with COVID, we saw this reemergence of interest in this type of lifestyle, and a lot of people got discouraged because you're going to fail a lot.
Yeah,
Quackgrass can completely discourage someone from continuing instead of
sure, because
figuring
you
out
don't
how to
realize.
solve the problem. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah.
and the other thing is, our culture is not used to hard work. 150 years ago, people were used to hard work. And, no matter what, the permaculture people where you plant it and then you sit back in your hammock, I don't think that works.
Well,
Yeah.
and both of you can speak to it in some respects, but our work, that there are certain segments of our population that are used to maybe what they think is hard work, but our whole relationship with work has fundamentally changed in the last 100 years. And
No
we
doubt.
used to work where we lived. And there's a difference between 3 hours in a field with a sigh and 3 hours in front of a computer. As you said on YouTube, on one of your videos, Jim, some of your best ideas have came to you while you're alone in the field, listening
Almost
to.
all of them. Almost all of them. It takes about an hour to get in that zone, but then you get these crazy, and I just call it information from the land. I've called it garden fairies talking to me, however you want to interpret it, but thoughts that have no basis on what I've read or anything else. It's just this, oh, what if I tried that? And that's been some of the most game-changing ideas in what I do.
And would you consider being in that zone work?
No, it's meditation. Because like Botan says, when you got that tool right and you're mowing a piece of ground that you've been working with for 3 or 4 years, so you know every bit about it and you've got it at the premium time to cut it, and you're out there, at 5:30 in the morning when the dew's on and the birds are singing, and yeah, I mean, that's irreplaceable.
But
Yeah.
I think that so from the outside looking in, we see physical movement for 12 hours a day, and flipping the hay after you cut it and putting it in a windrow and then coming back to get the other side to dry. And we view that entire process as a physical, that looks tough. But I'm not sure if even our ancestors viewed some of this stuff as work. They viewed it as living.
Yeah, I
My
agree.
yeah, my mother is from Germany, and in World War II, the city they were living in got bombed out, and they had to move to the relatives in the country. And my mom and her mom, my grandmother, one of their jobs was, help her in their keep was to go out into the hayfields and flip the hay with hay rakes.
Hmm.
And when my grandparents came to visit, I was like a teenager, and my dad we had a horse farm, and my dad had cut a bunch of hay. They asked if they could have rakes so they could go flip the hay because they remember enjoying it so much.
There's so
Yeah,
much to be said for a hand tool because, the tool, you pick up one of those old hay rakes with the thin handle and long, it's alive. I just never bought a tool like the ones I found at antique stores, and it
right.
feels so right. So there's so much, cultural wisdom built into those tools,
Right.
and as soon as we go mass marketing, we lose that. And that's why the Scythe is such an incredible tool, because it was developed over such a long period of time.
Yeah.
But well,
Yeah,
especially with. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'd like to, yeah, address this idea of hard work. So I wouldn't say it's hard work. I'd say it's constant work. You're just
Mm.
always busy. Mowing with a scythe, I mow pretty athletically, so I don't mow all day. I just mow for a couple hours. And I got a lot mowed in that time. And that's about all I can deal with the rest of the day if I'm making hay. Nice thing about using the directly on the windrows, I can use it right away. I don't have to, flip and tad and turn the hay until it's dry. But if I want it for my winter for winter feed for my chickens, if I have a nice patch of alfalfa, I'll have to come down and cut it. That's not hard to do at all, but I have to keep coming back again and again to get it to dry, flip it over. But none of that's flipping hay with a rake isn't hard. It's just there's just a tremendous volume of it and it takes a lot of time. It's constant work, I'd say, not
Yeah. One of the
hard work.
phrases I've come up with is, farming's multitudes of increments. Whether
Yeah.
it's, planting, mowing, you just do the same thing a lot of times. But, and it takes a certain individual to be able to do that, planting a row of, carrots, how I do that, I'm planting one at a time. But, I found, a lot of joy and pride in how they turn out. So,
Well,
yeah.
also the contrast. So again, 150 years ago, I don't know if I'm sure there were people that were begging for tractors. I'm sure there was, but the the ability to have a mechanized answer to your labor input creates the idea that physical labor with hand tools is therefore hard work because there
Sure.
is an
But
alternative.
yeah, but you're dependent on a machine.
Yeah.
It's so much. I've seen it so many times. The BCS guy, he just moved in down the street. Oh no, I'm waiting for them teeth, or I'm waiting for that gear, and you know, as long as I'm, got the coffee and oatmeal in me, I'm ready to go.
Yeah.
It's a matter of
Um,
scale. If you get machinery, you can, plow more land, bale more hay, have more animals.
Exactly. And that's where
But
I believe, the mechanization allowed us to step out of our traditional role in, the ecosystems we live in. It allowed us to step past where we're supposed to fit.
right,
And that hand tool is about the right scale to allow us, and it allows so many more people back on the land. The machines, all they did is take people off the land, put them in the cities or in the poorhouse, and they're. Whereas you can be out on the land making a living, growing food that feeds your neighbors and yourself in a scale that there can be hundreds of small farms again. But it'll be a while before we get there. But I'm seeing it
I
as a
lost you
very
guys.
possible and viable alternative.
Well, maybe culturally, but also spiritually for the individual.
Well, yeah,
It
yeah, no doubt.
Yeah, hard for me to feel connected to nature when I'm riding around in a tractor. It's
Yeah, that's what I would say. I mean, I don't want to. I want to be a farmer, not a machine operator.
right.
And farmers, the biggest, a careful farmer is the best thing farmland can produce. That's a Wendell Berry quote. And it's hard to be careful with a machine. But I am, you got some. I need to get moving to get my arugula delivery here soon. So if you want to wind some stuff up with me anyway.
no, you're totally fine. That we've had a good 50 minutes here of pretty good conversation, and if you guys have to get going, no big deal. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me, and
And I
let's
might
just.
be in Minnesota in June, and I might be driving, so I might look for your address, Botan. I'd like to see your place.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, let